You're listening to the Common Descent Podcast.
Hello, David.
Hello, Will.
And hello, listeners. Welcome back to the Common Descent Podcast. This is episode 190, and we will be discussing cicadas.
Cicadas. I had a brief moment when you said hello to me to do a spooky thing and just scream into the mic for the cicadas episode.
We will be discussing cicadas. These are super interesting insects that are particularly topical because we are in a year where there's going to be a whole bunch of them coming out this summer here in the U.S.
Starting shortly after this episode releases.
We'll talk more about that in the discussion, but keep your eyes out. This is a great way to gear up and get excited for cicadas. Cicadas are fascinating as a group in general, but particularly a number of members have very extreme lifestyles, and so we're excited to go through and talk about what a cicada is, what that lifestyle is, and then a whole bunch on how something like that would evolve, what sort of fossils do we have, the whole normal shebang, just with the particular focus on their crazy, crazy lifestyle.
Yes.
This episode, like all our episodes, was requested. We got requests from Larissa, Hugh, Nathan, Bear, Greenie, and Danielle.
Thanks, everybody.
Thank you for those. Before we get into the topic, let's do some announcements, and then we'll do news. First and foremost, our first announcement is that we have a Patreon.
Always have a Patreon.
We still have a Patreon. It funds the podcast top to bottom, and those who sign up for it can get all sorts of extra goodies, extra content, episode info, contact with us, live streams with us, etc., etc. One of the things they can get is shout-outs. We like to shout out some of our more recent patrons, and this episode we'd like to welcome Theo and wish a happy birthday to Allie.
Welcome and happy birthday.
Thank you for your support. If you would like to sign up for our Patreon or take a look at what it includes, you can find links down in the description.
Yes, along with other ways to engage with and support the podcast, Discord, we've got a merch store. There's all sorts of ways to participate.
Absolutely. In other news, announcements, not news yet.
Sure.
We just finished releasing the last episode of our Silver Screen Science this year, which was sharks. So you can check out all 3 episodes now that they're up.
Meg 2,
Meg
Deep
2,
Blue Sea, Jaws.
And Jaws, finally.
And there are episodes of More Thoughts for patrons.
Indeed. So check all that out if you're interested. And if you're yearning for more, we're not done yet. For the first time ever, we're doing a Silver Screen Science live stream to continue discussing movies and talk more about sharks in movies. And we will be doing that Sunday, May 5th.
Sunday, May 5th, 2 p.m.
2 p.m.
Eastern Time. Follow those links in the episode description for more info and the link to join the livestream on YouTube.
Absolutely. And then the final bit of extra content we have going right now, we still are releasing Spotlight episodes, Spotlight 2024. The next one will be coming out not too long after this episode releases, so you can keep an eye out for that.
And those are coming out every month for the foreseeable future with interviews with our fellow paleontology-related podcasters.
Tons of fun. Give it a listen. We'll be discussing science education, science outreach, SciComm, and how it's achieved in podcasting. And with that, we'll wrap up the announcements, move on to our first section, which is the news. Every episode, we like to gather some recent science news, evolutionary science, paleontology, earth science, etc. Help keep us all up to date on what's going on. What's the news, David?
Giant snakes.
That's fitting.
This is when sometimes the news comes out and you just know we're going to talk about it. And this happens far more often for Will than it does for me because snakes tend not to make the news unless it's a giant fossil snake.
Giant snake.
This is a different giant fossil snake. So I say giant fossil snake, and some people in our audience are like, oh, I know some of those. This one's new. This is research by Debajit Datta and Sunil Bajpai in Scientific Reports. And in the blog post for this episode, we will link to an article on Cosmos by Evrim Yazgin. We have spoken a number of times previously on this podcast about giant snakes. Giant snakes tend to fit into one of 3 large-bodied snake groups. Today, we've got boas and pythons. Those are our big-bodied snakes today. There is also an extinct group of large-bodied boa and python-shaped snakes called madsoids. This is a group of snakes that persisted from the Cretaceous all the way up to the end of the Pleistocene ice ages. We just missed out on having them today.
Bummer.
Mainly, they are known from southern continents, and they include a variety of quite large snakes, including Madsoya from the Cretaceous, Wanambi from Australia Pleistocene, and Gigantophis, to name a few. Gigantophis, for a while, held the record of largest known fossil snake.
Yes.
That's a snake from the Eocene of Egypt. This new study reports a new partial snake skeleton from the Eocene around 47 million years ago of Western India. These vertebrae are notable because they are distinct, they are a new species, and they're huge. Absolutely enormous. This new species has been named Vasuki indicus, indicus referring to India, and Vasuki, as the paper puts it, named for the Hindu mythical serpent Vasuki around the neck of Lord Shiva.
Oh, right.
That's pretty cool.
That's awesome.
That's a pretty cool namesake.
Ha!
The fossil snake Vasuki so far with this publication is known from 27 vertebrae.
Okay.
Now, that might not sound like a lot, and it's not a ton. That's only a portion of the snake. But for fossil snakes, that's fantastic.
Yes, like it's more than one. which is
which is we're off to a good start. The largest of these vertebrae are up to 6 centimeters long and 11 centimeters wide.
Wow. When you started saying 6 centimeters, I was like, oh, okay. And then you said long. I'm like, oh.
Yeah. And 11 centimeters wide.
Ooh.
These are huge. According to the article, when they were first discovered, they were tentatively identified as some sort of croc.
Yeah, yeah.
Which I like because, A, that gets across how unusual these look, and also I like a story where there's a happy ending. We thought it was this thing, and it turned out it was something way better than that.
Boo.
Based on these vertebrae, the authors were able to estimate the size of Vasuki. Now, for a reminder, the largest modern snakes, there are boas and pythons that both get up to the biggest sizes of modern snakes, which have been reliably recorded at up to the range of 7 meters.
Yes.
So a little over 20 feet long, which is huge. There are a bunch of ancient fossil snakes, like Paleophis, which might be as much as 9 or 10 meters long. Gigantophis, which was originally identified as 11 meters, which is 35 feet, although that was later revised.
Yeah.
And, of course, there's the famous record holder for biggest snake ever, Titanoboa, which is a boa from South America, from the Paleocene, estimated from several fossil specimens at between 13 and 14 meters long.
Unreasonable.
Which is like 42 to 46 feet.
Yep.
Which is a preposterously large snake.
Which is also one of those beautiful things of it means that, like, the biggest snakes today are around the same length as the biggest crocs, and the biggest snakes in the past were around the same length as the biggest.
Yeah.
Like, reptiles like to get to that same lengths, evidently.
The researchers describe the vertebrae of Vasuki as second only in size to Titanoboa.
Yeah.
And from those vertebrae, they estimate a full length of Vasuki. Now, only have 27 vertebrae of the snake. There are multiple ways to use that to estimate full length, depending on what calculations you're using, depending on what modern snakes you're comparing it to. So there is a range of estimates. The lower range of the estimates is 11 meters long, 35 feet, which I think automatically puts it at probably number 2.
Yep.
For the biggest fossil snake that we know. The upper range of the estimate is 15 meters, or a nice solid 50 feet long, which, if that's true, puts it just slightly longer than Titanoboa. Now, this is one study, and this is the first size estimate, so where exactly it fits within that range, or if it's maybe a little outside that range, we'll have to see for future research. However, even from what we have right now, this is for sure the largest known Madsoid snake. Definitely one of the biggest snakes in history, and possibly as big as Titanoboa.
Yeah. Insane.
So much.
Like,
so much snake.
It's when Titanoboa was discovered, it was just mind-boggling how much bigger it was.
Yeah, it's like a third again bigger than the next biggest fossil snake.
Yeah. The idea that might have been hit again by another group of snakes, and in a very different area of the world.
Yes, and this is something. So Gigantophis is from Eocene North Africa. Titanoboa is from Paleocene South America. There's another Indian early Cenozoic snake, Platyspondylopus, I think, which is also from India, similar time to Vasuki, which is Eocene India. There is the Paleophis, which I mentioned, the aquatic snake, is also early Cenozoic. This is a time period where there were a handful of these giant snakes, which is often attributed to the fact that this was an extremely warm time period.
Yeah, makes sense.
The Paleocene and the Eocene, episode 103, there were very high temperatures at this time, which is probably not the full story of why snakes got huge, but it could very well be part of the reason they were able to get this big.
It makes sense how it would have helped them get big.
Yes. In terms of ecology, based on where the fossils were found and the shape of the vertebrae, the deposit that it's found in is an ancient marsh. So the researchers infer that it was possibly similar to big pythons today, spending their time on the ground and maybe also semi-aquatic, so terrestrial to semi-aquatic. And comparing with a bunch of other Madsoid snakes, they found that Vasuki is closely related to Madsoia and Gigantophis, and suggests the possibility that there was a lineage of giant Madsoid snakes which might have originated in India or nearby and then spread later on.
Oh, gotcha.
So this might actually, Titanoboa is a completely different type of snake. Paleophis is a different type of snake. This suggests there may have been a related group of Madsoid snakes that just got huge.
Yeah. That was something about their lineage, that they were good at growing big.
Yeah. So there's another giant fossil snake out there, and it made the headlines because that's how you make headlines when you're a fossil snake. You either have to be gigantic or you have to have a name that makes people think that it flew.
Yes.
Those are two ways to do it.
Pretty much. This is very exciting to have another type of getting up to that sized snake.
Yeah, a 50-foot snake.
Yeah.
Again,
yes.
35 to 50 feet, somewhere
like,
in there.
Approaching that ridiculous upper limit, potentially upper limit, who knows?
The 100-foot snake, we're waiting for it.
When we find Jormungandr.
Yeah. The mid-Atlantic ridge.
Yes.
All this time, we thought it was mountains.
But it's exciting to have another one because I have so many questions, and I'm so interested for us to learn more about how these snakes might have been living and moving. Because, you want to compare to crocs again, but, I can picture a big croc acting like other crocs. Yeah. But snakes change very much the way they move. It's very different physics. Because you don't don't have limbs, and you're using this body in very different ways. Anaconda does not move like a corn snake, which is also a constrictor.
Yep.
They're both constrictors, but they do not move or hunt or do anything the same way. How in the world were these things moving around and hunting?
Yeah, slowly, one assumes.
Exactly. Was it a whole specific style to them that doesn't really compare to the ones we're seeing today, because it's just they had to do it that way. And now we have another one, so hopefully we'll find really good fossils.
Yeah, keep looking in India, apparently.
Yes.
There's a bunch from that region. India, South Asia, North Africa seems to be a place to find these giant Madsoid snakes.
Fantastic. Well, my news is also about big members of a group, just not nearly that big. These are big kangaroos.
Okay.
So not 50-foot long kangaroos.
Big enough to feed my giant snake.
Yes, but chunky kangaroos. This is a study that reanalyzed a group and identified some new species while also refining our understanding of the group. This is research by Isaac Kerr et al. In Megataxa, and the article is by Emma Perfetto in Cosmos magazine. So the group they're looking at is an extinct group of kangaroo cousins, the genus Protemnodon. These were found across Australia and New Guinea during the late Cenozoic, so between 5 million and 40,000 years ago. They went extinct in the late Pleistocene, and they were kangaroos, but a bit more muscular. One article described them as squatter. So just
Okay.
a bit more thick, robust.
80s action movie kangaroos.
Yeah. Like those, what's that one comic book artist that was
Yes.
famous for just overly buff dudes?
That several comic book artists.
Yep.
And so this is an 80s action movie kangaroo or a 90s comic book kangaroo?
Yes, exactly. This group has been known for quite some time. The genus was first named 150 years ago, but the understanding has been shaky because of partial remains. A lot of them are very partial individuals. And the focus on identifying species has been on teeth, as is often the case for mammals. This study wanted to reanalyze the specimens and do a overview and try to a review of the group to try to refine some of our understanding and also test out the identifying features. What features might actually be the best ones to use. So they did a review to re-diagnose Protemnodon and found a number of things. They were able to redefine the species. They recognize now a total of 7 species. I didn't mention how many were thought before,
Okay.
but this review
it's
found 7 as what they've considered confirmed, and 3 are new. 3 are new named species by this study. They also found that the cheek teeth were not as consistently useful in their analysis as compared to some of the cranium, so skull and postcranial, the rest of the body features.
Gotcha. That's not what you want typically here with mammals.
Yep. So they found that wasn't as useful for finding consistent species relation and groupings, at least in their approach.
Which makes sense, hearing that this group has had trouble being identified in the past.
Yes.
Because so often we rely on teeth.
That was what they were attributing part of it to, is that past studies relied heavily on the teeth, specifically the cheek teeth, and they were finding that probably actually isn't the best part to use.
Yeah.
So this might be a new way to analyze these animals and to identify species.
Cheek teeth, listeners, means like the molars and the premolars.
Yes. The ones.
In case you haven't heard that term before, these aren't like teeth growing out of the cheek. just the teeth that are covered by your cheeks.
Yep. No, a little bit less horrifying. They were also able to identify a variety of locomotor, so movement types and anatomies in different habitats across the group, showing that they were diverse and living in different regions in different ways.
Yeah.
The abstract for the paper goes through and lists each of the 7 species and about the features that they have. So
cool.
That's a fun read. But the 3 new species they identified was Protemnodon viator, which is from the Pleistocene, and was an almost complete specimen. So this one was a decent one, missing a few bones in the hand, foot, and tail, and likely weighed up to 170 kilograms,
Oof.
which is about twice as much as the largest male red kangaroos today.
Yeah, that's a giant kangaroo.
This is a big kangaroo. They noted that it was still long-limbed and probably could still hop fairly quickly and efficiently, probably similar to today's kangaroos. So it's just a very big kangaroo, but probably still moving a lot like kangaroos today.
Yeah.
And its name viator is Latin for traveler, because it was probably a good mover, and it lived in open areas, so it seems to be adapted for that. This is interesting because previously some interpretations of the group had read Protemnodon as a quadrupedal, walking on all fours group of kangaroos.
Yeah.
And hopping sometimes. There's kangaroos and cousins today, quokkas and things like that bound on 4 legs and hop on 2 legs sometimes. But they're more bounding kind of like a rabbit than doing the consistent hopping like kangaroos do.
Gotcha.
This group had been interpreted that way.
A 350-pound rabbit.
Yes, exactly.
Bouncing around Australia.
But now, this review of the group has found that probably only 3 or 4 of the species moved like that, while the others probably were moving a bit more modern kangaroo style.
Interesting.
So this is also reinterpreting our understanding of their anatomy and movement. The next new species is Protemnodon mamcura, also Pleistocene. This one, they said, was large, thick-boned, and robust, and likely quadrupedal. So this one does seem to fit that previously thought model.
Okay.
Likely slower moving, less efficient, and lived in a well-wooded area at the time.
Makes sense.
Which is
slower, less traveling movement.
Absolutely. And then the final one was Protymnodon dawsonae, which is a Pliocene species, and seemed kind of to be in between it. They said a mid-speed hopper. They compared it to a swamp wallaby, and I don't know enough about them to give you any further
All right.
info.
Well, as we keep learning, we have a massive contingent of fans from Australia. So all of our Australian listeners reach out to us and tell us all of the facts you know about swamp wallabies.
Yes. Like, to my knowledge, wallabies are kind of tiny kangaroos.
Yeah.
It's an easy way to sum them up. But this one was probably not the long-distance hopper that Viator was probably. So this study has shown potentially new ways to ID species in this group and a much wider variety of behavior or habitat and locomotor behaviors than was previously assumed for the group.
It's fun to get to learn about fossil kangaroos because kangaroos feel like one of those group of animals today that are so distinctive and weird and different compared to most other animals that I would fully believe it if they were the odd ones out in their group, like tree sloths.
Yes, exactly.
Where it's like, oh yeah, tree sloths are super weird, but most of sloths are not like that.
Yeah, they're weird for sloths as
These
well.
are all also weird for sloths, but it turns out that kangaroos are more like elephants.
Yeah.
It's like, yeah. Also in the past, there was a variety of different types of kangaroo that were still basically kangaroos.
Yeah, they mentioned that the Viator, being a long-legged, long-distance hopping kangaroo, is probably convergent. That's not just...
Yeah, it's happened multiple
Yeah,
times.
they also evolved to be that kind of kangaroo, separately from the kangaroos we have today.
Fascinating. Put in your request now for a kangaroo episode.
Yes, please!
Yeah. Let's do it.
Oh, I'd have so much fun.
For my second news, I'm going to talk more about the giant snake. No, I'm not going to do that.
I'm not done.
That's fine. It's fine. I'll do the giant snakes episode someday. My second bit of news is about dinosaur proteins, which is also pretty cool. This is research by Evan Saita et al. In the journal Geochimica et Cosmochimica Acta. And the article that we will link to is in The Conversation, written by the lead author, Evan Saita. This paper reports specifically the identification of amino acids in Cretaceous dinosaur-related fossils.
Cool.
For a reminder for anybody, your body is made up largely of proteins. Proteins are the large biomolecules that compose all the stuff in your skin and your cells. We're built of proteins. Proteins themselves are built of amino acids. These are the components that come together to make proteins. Your DNA tells your body how to put together amino acids and put together proteins out of those. The search for proteins in ancient fossils has been a major topic of research discussion over the last couple decades especially. There are a number of biomolecules that have been found to preserve really well in deep time. Things like pigments or steroids. We've talked about these on the podcast before. But proteins and genetic molecules and other organic compounds tend to break down into their parts over time and can be very difficult to identify in fossils.
Yeah, it's like a Lego set where
Yes.
if you break it apart, you might not be able to tell what it was before you put it together.
Ancient DNA, which we've talked about a bunch, episode 34, goes back to 1 or 2 million years ago. Proteins in fossils have been identified back to at least a few million years back. There have been lots of studies looking into cases of potentially older protein remains. There have been a bunch of claims of proteins or amino acids in Mesozoic and Paleozoic fossils, but these have often been challenged and rethought, identified instead as a misreading or contaminant from modern, bacteria and stuff that gets in there. In fact, if I'm remembering my authors and names correctly, some of the authors on this paper are noted for being on a number of research papers in the past that challenged previous claims of proteins found in fossils.
Yes. Yeah.
So some of these researchers have, part of their career has been publishing papers re-looking at other claims and finding evidence contrary to those discoveries. This study, and a lot of those previous claims have, the famous ones especially, have been dinosaur bone, protein, or other genetic-related compounds found potentially in dinosaur bone. These are often heavily debated. This study looked for evidence of amino acids in dinosaur eggshells. And the logic is thus. Dinosaur eggshells, like bird eggshells today, are made of calcite. Calcite is a mineral. If you've taken a geology class, you're probably familiar with calcite. Calcite is very stable, and previous research has found that amino acids from the egg, because eggs are made of proteins, all the things our bodies make, often made of proteins. Previous research has found that amino acids can get caught in little voids between the calcite crystals.
Oh.
And in the paper, they stress this point, not like the holes in, like pores in eggs, but the actual crystalline structure of calcite will have little gaps in it.
Yes.
And biomolecules can get stuck in those little gaps.
That's such a weird thing to think of, something that tiny getting stuck.
Yes, but it's
Crazy.
a little area.
Mm-hmm.
This has been found, not only seen in modern studies, but also in bird eggshells, going back over 4 million years ago, and mollusk shells, which are also made of calcite, up to 30 million years ago. So this study examined a bunch of dinosaur eggshells, which are also made of calcite, to see if they could find the same thing. They looked at eggshells of hadrosaurs, the quote duckbill dinosaurs, and titanosaurs, which are among the sauropods, the long-necked dinos, examples from Argentina, Spain, and China, ranging from 66 to 86 million years ago across the late Cretaceous, and found several lines of evidence supporting the presence of amino acids preserved within the little calcite structure of these eggshells.
Ooh.
These lines of evidence included multiple types of microscopy, spectroscopy, chromatography, looking for visual signals or chemical signals of amino acids. Not only did they find evidence of amino acids, they found signs that the amino acids that they were detecting were partially degraded. They mentioned they are in worse condition than other known examples of fossil amino acids, which makes sense because these are way older than those previous confirmed examples.
Yes.
They also mentioned that there are many different types of amino acids. They note that in this study, they were able to detect only certain types of amino acids, the ones that are known to be the most stable amino acids. Presumably all the others had degraded away, leaving only the longest lasting ones. Their evidence, they note, is consistent with reports from previous fossil studies, younger fossils finding amino acids, and modern experiments to see what happens to things like eggshell and amino acids as time passes. So, these authors note that by their estimation, this is potentially the most well-supported evidence of protein-related molecules in non-bird dinosaur fossils.
Nice.
That there are, like I said, there's been a bunch of other claims that have kind of gone back and forth. These authors consider this to be very well supported. Potentially the best example of that. Potentially also the oldest known protein or amino acid material supported by strong evidence. And above all that stuff, it teaches us that calcite can be a material that can preserve these kinds of biomolecules from the ancient past.
Yes.
Which is always one of the big challenges with trying to find rare evidence like this. This comes up with feather fossils and pigments and all sorts of stuff. Certain materials, certain minerals, certain habitats preserve different things better than others. There are certain parts of the body that if you want to study ancient DNA, you want this bone.
Yes.
Or you want this habitat because that's better. This study is potentially providing support that this mineral, calcite, might be the place to look if we want to find good evidence of ancient proteins.
That's awesome.
And calcite is what birds and other dinosaurs make their eggs out of. It's what at least some mollusk shells are made of. And the authors also point out that part of the exoskeleton of trilobites is made of calcite.
Right.
So there are other places that we could potentially look if it turns out calcite's the place to look. This can open up opportunities to look at evidence of proteins and functions and even genetic systems in a variety of ancient animals.
Which is the part of it that is so exciting because, like you said, different situations, different parts of the animal, different types of habitats, different lines of what you're looking for require and will react differently, so they don't all preserve evenly. You can't find them in every habitat, but we don't always know what those trends are.
Right. We have to start finding
Yeah, we don't always know. Like the first time we found preserved soft tissue, we didn't know why it preserved. We had to find more and find what the consistency was.
Mm-hmm.
This is one of those moments of we might have found a situation that we can, if it turns out to be consistent, is now a way to look for this piece of data.
Right. And in the case of something like dinosaurs, it tells us that, there's been a lot of studies looking at dinosaur bone as a source of this information. That might not be the best place to look.
Exactly.
Eggshell is made of a different structure. That might be a structure that is better off preserving this stuff.
Yes, and that just can make us more efficient at trying to study this this aspect of paleo biochemistry.
Yes.
We might now look in the better spots instead of just kind of testing around.
Yeah. Well, and if eggshell turns out to be a great source of this information, then fantastic news. We've got tons of dinosaur eggs.
Yep.
That's it. They're not like around every corner, but they are a quite abundant thing that has been found. Potentially lots of opportunities for sampling that. I don't know if pterosaur eggs are similar. I know we've got some pterosaur eggs in the fossil record.
Good point.
So maybe.
That would be interesting. How do different egg groups do?
Mm-hmm. Well, because it's the calcite.
Exactly.
It's that hard shell that... Like, snake eggs are not going to do as good a job. Snake eggs don't fossilize because they're leathery and soft. Same thing with croc eggs.
Yep.
Part of what makes bird eggs unique is that hard shell, and it's hardened with that calcite mineral structure.
Cool.
Pretty good stuff. Top that.
I will do my best. My final news is about toothed whales and their echolocation, and evidences for where the parts of those fat bodies that let them echolocate came from.
All right. That's pretty good.
I'm really happy with this one.
That's pretty good.
This one, ton of fun. This is research by Hayate Takeuchi et al. In Gene, the journal Gene.
Sure. Great. Gene!
The article...
Little X-Men humor for everybody out there.
Is a press release from Hokkaido University in Eureka Alert. This study is looking at the fat bodies, the acoustic fat bodies of toothed whales. So toothed whales, dolphins, orcas, your echolocating whales, have fat deposits in the head. The melon, that round part of the head, that's the big round bump behind the bottlenose dolphin's snout, and the big round bulb on a beluga whale.
Yeah, and that giant rectangle head of a sperm whale.
Yes. Those have fat deposits, big portions of fat that are really critical for focusing, transmitting, and conducting the sounds they produce to echolocate into the water the right way.
Yes.
Without those fat deposits, they wouldn't be able to echolocate.
For more on toothed whales, episode 172. For more on echolocation, put in your requests now. we haven't done that episode yet.
There are three main groups of acoustic fats. The melon, which is the forehead deposit. The extramandibular fat bodies, which are all along the jawbone, and the intramandibular fat bodies, which are within the jawbone.
Sure.
And those are important for receiving the sound. They pick up sound through the lower jaw, it transmits to their ears, and lets them actually interpret the echolocation they sent out. This study did comparative analysis of the DNA sequences of the genes of these acoustic fat bodies and related tissues to see what tissues they might have come from, how they might have evolved and developed. They measured gene expression in harbor porpoise and the Pacific white-sided dolphin, and found that the fat bodies possess characters of both muscle and adipose tissue. They found that the genes associated with muscle function and development were active in the melon and extramandibular fat bodies, and that they occupied what they called an intermediate position between the muscly functions and fat. That they have, though they still have they have features from muscles which the researchers read as implying an evolutionary connection that they may have evolved from muscle tissue.
Right.
That there was muscle in those areas or near those areas that over time developed into these fat bodies.
Yeah, or that the genes for producing muscle have been either adapted or co-opted
Yes.
as part of developing these echolocating tissues.
The intramandibular fat body, they suggested, originated from adipose tissue that was in the same area.
So fatty tissue.
Fatty tissue, because it shared features with white adipose tissue from the dolphins. They also found that the intramandibular fat body had active genes related to immune functions, likely due to its proximity to bone marrow, which is where a bunch of our immune system in mammals is active and located. Some of the elements were things like immune response and regulation of T cell formation were found in these, or genes similar to this were found in these fat bodies.
Gotcha. This is a common habit when we're trying to figure out how some sort of tissue or structure originated. We've talked about this with like snake venom. We've talked about this with insect wings, where we'll look at the development and say, all right, what genes are responsible for making this thing? And what other genes in the body are most similar to that? That this structure that is unique to this group is made of component parts that are either shared with or derived from those that are used for certain other body parts.
Yes. The most exciting of these examples to me is that the extramandibular fat body, so the one along the jaw, identified as potentially homologous with the master muscle, which in us connects the jawbone to the cheekbones and is one of our main chewing muscles.
Oh.
And that this seems to be homologous, that the structure is the same place and potentially same developmental pathway.
So that portion of echolocator tissue might be derived from chewing muscles.
Yes. And this makes sense because one of the things that toothed whales do is swallow without chewing. Oh. And that this could be something that came from the radical reshaping that happened to their body and their face when they went back to the water, but that they have lost they either lost or no longer needed the ability to chew.
Right. We also have talked about how whales have moved away from those complex chewing teeth that we often see in mammals to a more standard croc-like catching fish and swallowing them teeth.
Which could have freed up those muscles to no longer have a selective pressure, that there's not any reason for those to stick around, and allowed them to be repurposed evolutionarily.
There wasn't any major detriment to them accruing changes. They were basically free real estate for evolution to act upon.
And so that may have been there may be a direct connection to them adapting to the water, getting this new feeding style, and then getting these new acoustic fat bodies.
Yeah. That's a very cool insight. It makes me wonder now if we can go back through the whale fossil record. Do we see signs on the skull that indicate the shape of those chewing muscles?
Yep.
And is there a correlation between those chewing muscles diminishing and these echolocating tissues developing?
Yeah, could we see from ambulocetus in those early first whales going from prominent cheek muscles to less and less as they develop down this line?
Yeah, and then the same, we can see the space for where the melon is and those other things. Oh, cool. Evolution in Whales, episode 41. This also raises the question for me of what were bats doing?
Yeah.
What now? Do the same study but with bats?
Yes. Yeah.
Bats don't have a melon, right?
No.
They're doing it in a different way.
Yeah, because they still have ears.
They have ears. Yeah, they have big satellite dish ears that toothed whales do not have.
And they aren't having to transmit into a liquid.
Yes.
So they're transmitting into air.
Fully different type of echolocation.
Which is already what vocal cords are supposed to do.
Yes.
And with that...
Speaking of animals that make notoriously interesting sounds...
Absolutely. We will move on to our main discussion and start talking about cicadas, the just noisiest of insects, and what makes them so unique.
Gene!
Cicadas are a majorly charismatic and famous group of insects.
Yes.
With good reason. They are found worldwide. They're found on every continent but Antarctica, as is the insect way.
As is the phrase. Found on every continent, but that's the end of that sentence.
Yep. There's 3,000 roughly species on Earth today.
Wow.
And they are found basically, as it was put in one wording, in every deciduous forest. So any forest that loses its leaves, there's likely a cicada species
if
at least
you have
there.
Forest, there's cicadas.
Yeah.
Well, cicadas are big and famous and fascinating insects, which is how you get an episode to yourself on the Common Descent podcast.
Yes.
Like we did ants and we did dragonflies. Yeah, because they're cool and famous. And for this episode, topical.
Yes, absolutely. We'll get into more of that, but there's going to be a lot of talk about cicadas this year.
Yes, and specifically around the time that this episode
coming
drops.
up in the next couple of months.
We don't often theme our episodes to like specific times of their release, but this is one of those.
So let's walk through what a cicada is. They are members of the true bugs, the Hemiptera. These are a major group of insects, 80,000 species. They include things like plant hoppers, aphids, assassin bugs, bed bugs, insects with piercing mouth parts. That's often how they are described. They all have a piercing, sucking mouth part.
Yes, this is to the exclusion, for example, of ants and beetles and butterflies. This is, in my mind, it's kind of the other bugs category. It's not fleas and it's not light. It's other bugs.
Yes.
But they do all share that lifestyle, that feeding behavior.
Yes, that piercing mouthpart can be used on plants, like aphids that suck up the fluids of plants. But assassin bugs, water striders fall into this group, use them to pierce other insects and suck out their juices.
Yes, plants are not the only juicy things around.
Exactly. Cicadas fall into a suborder that includes them as well as leaf hoppers, tree hoppers, plant hoppers, and spittle bugs, all of which produce noise.
Okay.
They all produce vibrations. That's one of the things that characterizes this group. Many of these, it's just vibrations, like through the plant that they're on. So it's not audible sound, but...
Yeah, it's like the insect version of elephant communication.
Yes, exactly, yeah.
Communicating through the ground.
Yep, I know there's a lot of aphids and stuff that communicate that by thrumming on the leaf or on the plant. This whole group shares that feature.
Interesting.
Of some sort of vibrational communication. The superfamily, Cicadoidea, is where we get our cicadas. This is sister to the frog hoppers. They're their most closely related other group is the frog hoppers.
Okay.
Though cicadas are not nearly as hoppy as they're all... As you notice a bunch of these.
I was going to say, there's a lot of hopping in here.
Cicadas are not particularly hoppy, which sets them apart from a lot of their cousins.
Yeah.
There are two families of cicada. The Cicadidae, which is what you typically think of. This is basically all cicadas.
Right. The ones that everyone's going to be talking about this year.
Yes.
Cicadidae.
There's another family, which is the Tedigarctidae, which only has two species.
Oh.
One in Australia, one in Tasmania. So those are important, and they will come up more when we talk about the fossil and evolutionary record.
That makes sense. Like a lot of groups of animals today, there's the main group and then this little group of weirdos that are important in the evolutionary history of this group of animals.
Absolutely. These are often called the hairy cicadas. And they do the vibrational communication, but they do not sing.
Oh, they're quiet cicadas.
They are quiet cicadas.
Silent cicadas.
The other group, the Cicadidae, are often called the singing cicadas.
Okay.
These are the ones that make the famous cicada call.
Right. Cicadas, there are a lot of bugs are famous for noises. Cicadas are among the most famously noisy insects.
Because they're arguably the loudest insects. I don't know if there's anyone else that's challenging them, but they're often listed as the loudest insects. And some of the loudest animals. Just
some of the loudest things.
Yes. They can cause hearing damage if you stay around cicadas for too long.
Yeah.
They're often compared to things like lawnmowers and chainsaws.
Yeah. Which is truly a preposterous superpower for an organism to have.
They're ridiculous. They're found across every continent.
Except Antarctica.
Most have more than 100 species. Europe has notably fewer.
Okay.
It was noted that only a few species found in Europe.
Sorry, Europe.
Yep. But most others have 100 or more species. Australia was listed having several hundred, and Latin America having 800. So, just tons all over the place. They differ from their close cousins in a few ways. We mentioned that they're not very hoppy. Mm-hmm. They have very much advanced their sound-producing organs, so they are very specialized in cicadas.
What they lack in hopping, they make up for in screaming.
Absolutely, yes. It may not have ups.
Like, I'm not going to hop over there. I'm just going to shout. I'm just going to yell, "Hi!"
Their piercing rostrum also is located differently on the head.
Oh, their mouth parts.
Their mouth part is in a different spot. And their wings can link together. They have 2 sets of wings, so 4 wings in total.
Sure. Typical of insects.
Mm-hmm. Large front wings, smaller back wings, and they can click together basically with a curled edges of the front and back wings.
Like a cape that clasps together in the front.
Yeah, so they have, when they flap, it's effectively 2 wings.
Gotcha.
The 4 wings move, the 2 wings on either side move together.
Oh, okay. Oh, so each side's wings.
Yes, exactly. Yeah. They click together, front and back click, so that you have a solid wing surface.
Gotcha. I was imagining them connecting together.
Yeah,
like
when they fold back.
When they fold back. Mm-hmm. But oh no, that's interesting.
Yes. So, and if you watch like slow-mo of them flying, it moves as one wing surface. Yeah. They are large for insects, is another notable thing about them. On average, they can be found to be around like 2 to 5 centimeters, which is not nothing.
Pretty big.
The largest is the Malaysian Empress or Emperor. I saw both listed.
Okay.
Cicada, which can grow up to 7 centimeters long, almost 3 inches, with a wingspan of 18 to 20 centimeters. Whew. That's not quite a foot. That's 2/3 of a foot.
Yeah.
But that's still a lot.
That's a big cicada.
That's a big cicada. They use their mouth parts to feed off of plants. They suck up xylem, the plant blood, which is not very nutrient rich, so they drink a lot of it. Mm-hmm. And they have bacterial symbionts that help produce the essential amino acids from that. So they have characteristic bacteria that live inside them. One which they share with their close cousins, Sulcia, but another, Hodgkinia, which is unique to cicadas.
Okay.
They have prominent compound eyes, which is one of the most famous things. They have those wide set, often red-colored eyes for many species. That front section of the face that is so famous, that cell mouth from DBZ,
yes,
that patterned section of the face is actually a muscular pump for the sucking of the piercing mouth. This is called the postclipeus, so that kind of nose section of the face.
Yeah.
They have short antennae, so not very notable antennae structure. And then the famous thing about them is their noise-making structure. Mm-hmm. They have, all cicadas have some form of a paired structure that are on either side of the body called tymbals, which are convex, so like they stick out little dome structures with a muscle attached to the surrounding structure. When that muscle is tightened, these ribs that are along that dome collapse and buckle in, and they buckle in, as they put it, a stepwise manner with each rib tick, 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 buckling, and that's where the noise comes from. And then when the tension's released, they unbuckle quickly. Right. And that so buckling and unbuckling and that grrr of the ribs buckling is what gives them that kind of continuous call that they're so famous for, that seeming non-ending call. They also have a bunch of adaptations to help make this call more effective. The males, who are the typical ones making the loud calls, their abdomen is mostly hollow to amplify the noise.
Big empty space.
Just a big drum.
A little amphitheater inside.
Yep. They evidently will also use the air chambers in the trachea to help amplify it as well. They can also modulate the song by moving the wings and directing the sound in different directions, or moving the abdomen closer or farther away from whatever they're sitting on.
Yeah.
To change the resonance and the pattern. And most species have species-specific songs, so they will only be calling mates of their own species when they sing. It
is fascinating to think of a group of animals that have evolved their entire body into a musical instrument.
Yep.
Just the whole, I change the position of my limbs and where I'm standing on the ground and where my wings are to adjust the sound that comes out. Just the whole body is the instrument.
Yes.
That's so cool.
And you'll have ones that use it differently. Some sit and call. And sometimes they'll group together with a chorus, as it's often called, of males, all calling together, and their sound can increase, like, I don't know if it's proportionately, but in relation to the amount of males calling.
Yeah.
It goes from a da-da-da-da-da-da to just a constant drone that's so famous for the summers when cicadas come out.
Yeah.
But there are also others that fly and search for females while calling less loudly.
Interesting. I was wondering if are there some that call in the air?
Yes.
Because we so often think of animals making their calls from a stationary position.
Yes.
Like birds perched and singing and frogs sitting in one place. It's fascinating to think of a group of animals that does their mating call on the move, especially does their mating call while flying, which is already a very energetically costly thing to do.
Yep.
I would imagine, like the same reason that I don't shout and run at the same time.
Yes.
Something that's hard to do two strenuous things at the same time. That's an impressive feat to fly and sing at the same time.
Absolutely. They are the quieter of the
Sure,
singers.
they're not belting
Which
it out.
makes sense for all the reasons you just gave that. They're not the ones that are getting as loud as possible. There are some cicadas that have stridulation structures. So they can, and they still have the tymbals, so they still can make their call, but they also can have rubbing sections. These are, from what I read, usually on the wing rubbing on a mid-thoracic region. So on the body.
Right. This is famously how crickets and katydids and stuff make noise, is you have a comb that is rubbed against another structure and it goes brrrr, like a washboard, and that's where that sound comes from.
And I think crickets, it's on each wing rubbing together.
Yeah, I think that's true.
This one, it sounds like it's the wings rubbing on the body doing it. And they can use both stridulation and the call, like, in combination.
So they have multiple instruments.
Yes. This can be found on both male and females. The females typically don't make the call. They're not attracting males with the same kind of call, but they will click their wings to show reception. So that's their way of signaling a male that the call has worked and attracting the male over. One paper I read noted that when a female clicks to signal their receptivity, other males could just swoop in and mate with that female that weren't the ones whose call the female was responding to. And so there are some species where the males can produce a scrambling call to cover up the female's clicks so that hopefully other males don't hear it.
So that only they can go, wow, that's...
So they'll try to muffle it.
A destructive interference
yes.
to mess with that sound.
Of course, if they're making calls, they have to have a way to hear them, and they do all have a ear-like structure, the tympana, and we talked about that in the ear episode, that they can have sections of the body that act like an eardrum, basically.
Yeah, this is pretty common in insects.
Yes.
Instead of an eardrum being deep inside an ear like we have it, this is what we see. I mean, this is also, you see this in frogs. There's a lot of animals where it's basically an eardrum just right on the outer wall of the body.
Absolutely. One of the things that I've seen mentioned, I didn't find a lot of detail, so I don't know if this is all cicadas or some cicadas, but I've seen it mentioned that males can disable their tympana to avoid damaging their hearing while calling.
Yes, I have heard that, and it is ridiculous. Turn the ears off so that I can make the call without damaging my own hearing.
Because they can get up to like 120 decibels.
Super loud.
So loud. And they're calling just as much as they can.
Well, and they're also, as you said, often surrounded by other calling cicadas.
Take this as your bit of advice. Wear earplugs when working around heavy equipment or cicadas.
Yes, if you're going out to observe the cicadas, earplugs.
Protect your hearing.
The cicadas aren't even listening to themselves.
No, they're taking precautions.
They are taking precautions. They've got their PPE in position.
Speaking of PPE, evidently they pee weird.
Oh.
Yeah, evidently cicadas urinate oddly for insects. I found one study talking about this. They pee in a stream, which may not sound weird.
Same.
But most sap-sucking insects flick droplets of pee away.
Huh.
And it was thought this was for a couple of reasons. Of one, they're too small to form a stream. That
just like the physics of the fluid.
The surface tension of water at that size, you would have to force it at such a speed to form a stream that it's just not energy efficient.
Right, so it's just droplets instead.
Yeah, so you do droplets, and a lot of them flick it away to try to keep it from signaling where they are or gathering where they are.
Sure.
But cicadas are larger insects, and as they described it, such voracious eaters that it would be inefficient to flick away the pea because they wouldn't be able to flick it away fast enough.
Yeah, they got to get rid of it.
They would have to slow down how much they're eating, and they would be losing energy because they'd be slowing down their process. And so they're able to pee in a stream. There's tons of videos you can find on YouTube of it, and evidently it's been kind of a known thing, but only recently has been studied and found that they are doing something unique and has potentially shifted the way we understand fluid dynamics at that scale.
Yeah, so when you say the cicadas pee weird, what you meant was they pee normal.
Yes.
And that's unusual for insects.
Exactly. So yeah, very interesting on insects.
If you had cicada pee on your episode 190 bingo card, there you go. You could check out that box.
But by far the most famous and craziest thing about them, other than their singing, is their life cycle.
Yep.
And that's what we'll be talking about for the rest of this first section, because their life cycle is crazy.
This is the life cycle. There are some animals and some topics where this topic comes up and we are now talking about this animal.
Yep.
Like when eusociality comes up, it's like, all right, ants.
Yep.
We're mostly just going to talk about ants. When life cycles and dormancy and longevity come up, you know cicadas are in that list. They are among the most famous animals in the world for having an unusual life cycle.
Indeed. So first, basic cicada life cycle. They start out as nymphs underground, attached to, clinging to roots of plants, sucking the sap underground. They stay down there most of their life, and then once they've reached typically the 5th instar, which means the 5th time they've molted, their mature form, they dig their way out, climb up to the surface, and then climb up structures, but usually plants in the wild, cling to the surface of the tree with their little digging arms that they have, and then molt for the final time into the adult cicada, which now has the flying wings and all the things we were just talking about. The nymphs look very different in the fact that they've got those digging front arms and no wings, but still have a fairly cicada face.
Sure.
The adults tend to only live for a few weeks, maybe a little bit more than that, but typically die within a month of coming out. And they can keep eating, but their focus is now mating. They call, they mate. Females then use an ovipositor on their abdomen to slice into plant stems and bark and other structures to lay their eggs inside plants. When those eggs hatch, the larvae dig down and the cycle repeats.
In many ways, this is very similar to the life cycle we talked about for dragonflies in episode 181. They start as nymphs, in that case underwater, for X number of years, and then climb out to turn into winged adults for a relatively short amount of time.
Yes. Most cicadas, that life cycle happens within 2 to 5 years, which is a decent amount of time for an insect.
Yep.
That is a fairly long-lived insect. There are many species, many here in North America known and are called jar flies or dog day cicadas that come out yearly, that are just yearly cycled and come out in the summer, which is why they get the dog day name. And that's the typical rule for most cicadas. They stay underground for a couple of years, maybe a few years, come out, mate, lay eggs, and then those nymphs go back underground for the next few years. The famous examples are the periodical cicadas. These are cicadas that have extremely long life cycles with incredible lengths of dormancy underground and synchronized emergence when they become out to molt finally and become adults. That's the distinct thing, is the other cicadas are just kind of, the other cicadas aren't in sync with each other. Right. On their emergence and their dormancy.
Every year or whatever, during the summer, you'll get this gradual emergence of cicadas.
Yes. These sync up. They are dormant for the same years and then all come out at once.
Yep.
There are a few groups that fall into this category. In northeast India, the World Cup cicada, which emerges every 4 years, coinciding with the Soccer World Cup, Football World Cup.
Fantastic.
In Fiji, there's the Nanai, which is an 8-year cycle. But the most famous is here in North America, we have the genus Magicicada, which go through 2 different cycles of 13 and 17-year dormancies and emergences. These are the most extreme form of periodical lifespan. Like, there's not many animals that go through multi-year life cycles. That's not super common in general. And this is by far the most extreme and the longest life cycle of an insect.
Yeah, just disappearing essentially for 13 to 17 years, which is a long time. That's long enough for a human being to grow into essentially legal adulthood.
That's some of these cicadas can go underground. You can get a puppy, and that puppy
full life
will not get to see
cycle.
those cicadas come out of the ground. That's how long they can be underground. And also, when they emerge, the emergences are huge. Millions, potentially billions. I've even seen it cited as sometimes trillions of cicadas coming out within days of each other, all at once. I saw it listed as the densities can exceed 300 individuals in a square meter in some forests, and in fertilized areas, 600 individuals in a square meter.
You just can't see for the cicadas.
Just every inch cicada. These are found only here in the U.S., east of the Great Plains. So these are a eastern U.S. species, and there are actually multiple species. There's 3 species groups, each which includes both members that have 13 and 17 year cycles.
Right, so each group has done both.
Yes. 2 of the groups have one of each, and then one has 1 17 and 2 13 year groups. So they all have members doing both cycles. The 13 and 17 are roughly separated into slightly different areas, with 13 year cicadas being in the northeastern and the 17 being more southeastern.
Okay.
They do have overlap, and they do have they border up on each other all over the place, but there is a slight distinction with the 13 year cycles being slightly more northerly and 17 being slightly more southerly. Now, there are multiple groups of these different cycling cicadas. So it's not that there are no cicadas coming out in between the 17 years or 13 years that a group is underground.
Right.
Because
there are different 13-year cycles,
Exactly.
different 17-year cycles.
If one group went underground 13 years ago, they're going to come out this year. The one that went underground 12 years ago is going to come out next year.
Right.
The one that went out 10 years ago, so on and so forth, da-da-da-da-da. These group emergences are called broods, and they've been numbered. All the cicadas that emerge in 2012 are brood 1, 2013 brood 2, 14 brood 3, and so on. They were named by different authors and then eventually renamed and numbered with the Roman numeral system to make it more useful. And the grouping I found, and I found slightly different things because it has adjusted as some of these broods no longer have maintained. 17-year cicadas are broods 1 through 13.
Confusingly.
Yep. And brood X evidently is one of the largest known. It's a famously large brood.
Yeah.
13-year cicadas are numbered 18 through 30, but there's not ones for all of those. So some of these are no longer emerging.
Right. Some of the numbers have been retired.
Yes. Some have gone extinct. They're definitely a brood can go extinct, and there's a couple reasons that can happen, but currently, there's roughly 12 recognized 17-year cicadas and 3 13-year broods. Many broods will contain all 3 species groups, so they can sync up across the species groups, and that's the brood. So it's not species specific, it's year specific.
Yeah, so multiple species can be emerging together.
Exactly. This is why this episode's more timely. 13 and 17-year broods don't sync up very often because those are both prime numbers.
Yes.
Which means they don't form patterns very nicely.
Yes. So once every long, long time will they actually emerge at the same time.
221 years.
That's how long the time is.
Because 13 times 17 gets you 221 years.
Yes.
The last time a 13 and 17-year brood synced up was in 1803. 2024 is the next time.
Here we are.
Where brood 14 and brood 8 are going to sync up and emerge this year, this summer. They're expected to merge sometime starting mid-May and probably ending in late June. This is hard to determine for sure because the thing that triggers their emergence, the one they tell which day they're going to emerge, is based on soil temperature.
Okay.
So changing temperatures and fluctuating temperatures can adjust when exactly they trigger. If the things are warmer, they might also finish mating sooner, so it might not be as long all the way to late June. And with this winter having been slightly warmer, that might also have adjusted their timing, but probably emerging sometime around April or May and going into June. And it will be happening across 15 states, roughly, probably to varying degrees, but still. I'm going to list them out here so that you all can keep an eye out if you're in one of these U.S. states.
Yeah.
Alabama, Arkansas, Georgia, Illinois, Indiana, Iowa, Kentucky, Louisiana, Michigan, Mississippi, Missouri, North Carolina, South Carolina, Oklahoma, Wisconsin, Virginia, and Tennessee. So we don't have to travel.
We just listen. We just wake up and hear them outside.
It's gonna be loud.
Whew. You said the last time that this synced up, was that the last time these specific broods synced up?
Yes, I believe so.
Okay.
And I haven't seen anything other mentioning of other times them syncing, other broods syncing.
Cool.
So if you're in those areas or near those areas, keep an eye out. This should be literally a once-in-a-lifetime experience.
Yeah, I was going to say, the last time these two broods synced up was several human lifetimes ago.
Yep, and it should be a double, dosage of emerging cicadas. So it should be very, very interesting to see and quite the spectacle.
Well, we get a solar eclipse.
Yeah!
We get the cicada. This is a great year.
These emergences also have huge effects. These are massive natural phenomena, and they have huge ecological cascading effects.
Oh, yeah. If you thought our examples in the migration episode were major ecological impacts, this is ridiculous.
These are, first off, cicadas are listed as one of the primary herbivores in forests because they are sucking so much fluid from plants that they are by far one of the biggest feeders on plants. I found differing notions of how much that affects plant health. Some things that did seem to notice an uptick in plant growth after cicadas emerged and there were no nymphs feeding on roots for a little bit, and others that didn't seem to notice as much of a change, so it might not have that huge of an effect. But one of the important things that does come from them feeding on plants so much is that they're taking a very nutrient-poor substance, which is the xylem from the plants, processing it with their symbionts to make it into good food, and then coming out of the ground where a bunch of other animals can get to this nutrition.
Yes, they're turning poor nutrition into lovely little protein packets that all sorts of animals can eat.
Little flying gushers.
As always, insects, nature's trail mix.
Yep.
Gusher, gross.
Yeah.
That was a gross analogy.
That's how I've heard them as juicy. Because people have eaten these. There are people who eat these.
How could you not?
Yep.
This is like locusts.
Yes.
It's like people eat, well, yeah, of course you would. It would be a waste not to.
Yep. It has been noted that predator populations uptick after a cicada emergence. But the cicadas emerge in such densities that, like sea turtle nests hatching and other animals that use mass spawning, there's just too many for the predators to eat, so they are satiated. That was a word used over and over again. This is predator satiation technique. There's too many to eat, and you will get full before we're done mating, so you're going to stop eating us.
A bunch of cicadas will survive. There are just too many cicadas to eat them all.
Yeah, and I liked that specification because often when it's described of like there's too many for the predators to get them all, it's kind of sometimes portrayed as like the predators just can't keep up with these numbers, and like no matter how good the predator is at hunting, they won't be able to hunt all. Here it's no, you can't eat this much.
Yes.
Your stomach would explode.
There is not enough space or time
yes.
for you to do this much eating.
You would make yourself sick if you tried to keep eating. You will get full and you will be satisfied, and we will just keep mating.
It is an endurance strat. Don't worry, they'll get tired of eating. They'll get full eventually, and then we will persist.
Exactly. And because of this fact, most cicadas just end up dying at the end of their life cycle, and their bodies fall down to the forest floor where they fertilize the forest.
Back to the floor whence they came.
Absolutely. It's been noted upticks in bacterial and fungal growth after a cicada emergence with all these rotting bodies
I bet.
having to be decomposed. I saw one note, nitrogen in the soil rising 2 to 3-fold after a cicada emergence, of just this nutrients getting shot right back into the forest floor after they die. And some studies noticing increased growth in certain trees. I saw one noting that you can, in some trees, tell cicada emergence years in the tree rings.
Oh, cool. I was wondering.
Yep.
That's awesome.
But it also has other cascading effects. This is one I hadn't thought of, but is fascinating. When cicadas emerge and birds can hunt these juicy little packets, they stop hunting other stuff. As the title of this article said it, when the birds gorge on cicadas, caterpillars go unchecked.
Huh.
And they noted that in years where cicadas, and at least the ones they studied, where cicadas emerged and the birds fed on them, first they noted that tons of birds eat them. 80 species were noted.
Oh, sure.
So, like, in birds
Again,
they weren't expecting.
It would be foolish not to.
They noted that some of the birds were too small to eat the cicada whole and had to eat it bit by bit. But they were still eating cicadas. And that they tested the hunger for the birds toward caterpillars by putting out models, clay models, and seeing how much they were pecked. And that 25% of the models were pecked before the emergence. But after, fewer than 10% were pecked.
Ooh.
And once the cicadas had finished mating, it went back up to 25%. But during the cicada emergence, they weren't targeting them, and they even were able to count more caterpillars on the trees and measure that they were getting bigger. At least some species were growing larger, and the leaves seemed to be eaten more thoroughly.
So this predator satiation strategy isn't just protecting the cicadas that survive. It's protecting the other animals in the environment that might otherwise be eaten.
And so this could also be another way that cicada emergencies could affect that tree ring growth, is it might actually hurt some trees if their other predators do better.
It's fascinating to think about just a whole ecosystem full of animals. Just, this is it. All the predators are like, here we go, we're going to get tons of food. And all of the prey species are like, we're going to have a party.
Yes.
All the predators are going to be occupied. We're just going to go nuts.
The heat's off.
Yep.
Now, one of the interesting things with these cicada emergencies, and we'll talk more about this after the break, there aren't a lot of cicada specialists for these groups because it's too long. Most of these predators won't live to see the second emergence.
If you can't be a cicada specialist if you only get to eat certain years.
Yes. But there are organisms that react and do specialize on cicadas. The first one to talk about is the host plants do have defenses because they are the ones being fed upon. And there are a number of species noted that will react to the eggs being laid in the plant tissue, of overgrowing or smothering them with gums and excretions, or releasing chemicals to kill the eggs, which they noted is often probably sufficient to protect that plant because the nymphs do not move far. Once they hatch, they drop down and they burrow down and they can dig and get down to a root, but they're not very mobile. So if the eggs on that tree get killed, that tree's probably fine. Yep. Nymphs from other trees are probably not going to make it to it very well. This also means that if anything happens to the tree while the nymph is down there, the nymphs don't have much to do. So if a tree gets cut down, those nymphs are done for. They can't find a new root, really. They're not quite that good at getting around. I found one note of an Australian katydid that imitates the female wing clicks to attract males and then eat them.
Ah, cool.
Which is pretty awesome.
I mean, if you're going to be making that much noise, I might as well take advantage of that.
Absolutely. And speaking of taking advantage of it, back to the magic cicada, there is a fungus that parasitizes the cicadas. This is Massospora, the genus Massospora. There's 11 different species within this group. They are cicada-specific parasites. I saw one thing that seemed to say that they might only be on magic cicada, but another one mentioned that 15 species are parasitized by them.
So possibly some other cicada species.
But all 7 species of magic cicada are vulnerable to this parasite. And they attack the cicadas in one of the most bizarre fungus cycles just ever. Their spores sit in the ground dormant for the same amount of time the cicadas are dormant. And while the cicada nymphs dig up to the surface, they pass by the spores in the ground and become infected. So they just leave these little spore landmines all around for 13 to 17 years.
Because most predators can't just wait around for 13 to 17 years.
Yep.
But fungus can.
Yep. Once a cicada is infected, there's 2 stages that happen. First, the spore germinates and invades the cicada's body. It fills the cicada's abdomen with fungal tissue.
That's really going to mess up the sound production.
Yep. And it causes their butt and genitals to pop right off, as it was put by one expert.
That's not what you want to happen to those
Yep.
parts.
It then forms a plug of fungal spores in that opening that just, it looks like they've got a dusty butt or like...
It makes a fungus butt?
Yes.
A prosthetic fungus butt?
Basically. Then it releases chemicals and starts to alter the cicada's behavior and causes them to seek out mates and will make them, including males, make the wing clicks to attract other males ready to mate. And when they come down and try to mate, they rub their abdomen against the spore butt and become infected themselves.
Weird.
Yep. And then those infected ones, from what I saw in one, it sounds like it does a slightly different cycle in those where those, it does the same thing of infecting the abdomen, causing their butt to fall off. But the spores those produce are the ones that will lay dormant. So those just sprinkle off the cicada, fall on the floor, and wait for the next round.
Weird.
Yep.
It's like a weird host manipulation and also body manipulation STD.
Yes, exactly. And that's one of the things they note is unique about it, of like, mind-controlling funguses and insects, that's old hat. Sure. That's normal.
Ants, it happens. Termites,
almost every insect group has a fungus that messes with their mind and turns them into a horrific mummified spore colony.
That is a true statement.
Yes.
That's not what this episode is about. But set that little factoid aside. That's true.
But most of them, the insect gets infected, and then a fruiting body of the fungus comes out and spreads spores from that dead body.
Right. Over the colony or just over the habitat to then infect other insects, hopefully.
Hopefully nearby enough to others of that insect's kind so they get infected. Some can do slightly more fancy things like attracting others to come toward the body.
Sure. Or they make them jump into the water and then the spores swim around in the water.
This is a very rare case of the insect is the one doing the transmitting while alive.
Yeah.
It's actually getting them to spread the fungus themselves. That's not the norm.
It's like pollination almost.
Yeah. And it's just so gross looking.
Yeah.
You can find tons of pictures. It just looks like half a cicada with a fuzzy back end. And they're still walking around because they don't know anything's wrong.
Because they're bugs.
And they're hyped up on a bunch of chemicals. There's like a psychedelic mushroom. The same chemicals from those are being pumped out by the fungus to get them to still fiercely mate and seek out hosts. Or mates. Technically both.
Sure. Well, and it's hard to imagine a more fruitful scenario for a fungus to spread than 600 individual cicadas per square meter.
Yeah.
But yeah, you're going to infect a lot of cicadas that way.
It's one of those situations where it's almost surprising this isn't like colony wasting disease or like...
Right? It's almost surprising there are still cicadas.
Yeah, like how is this not just wiping you out? Because there's so many cicadas.
Because you don't comprehend what a billion cicadas means.
Yep. There's tons more that could be said about how crazy the numbers of cicadas are.
Yes. And there are sure to be tons of articles being written about all of these exact topics around spring and summer of this year.
Absolutely. But for now, we will pause here for our mid-discussion break, and when we come back, discuss the fossil record and evolution of cicadas, and how we think this really wacky lifestyle could have come to be.
It'll be worth the wait.
As is tradition when discussing an invertebrate group, fossil record ain't great.
This is why we don't talk about them.
Nope. There's not a lot of nice cicada fossils.
Yeah, that makes sense.
They definitely exist. Mostly they are wing fragments.
Sure. Like dragonfly.
Like dragonflies. And much like them, the veins, the patterns of the veins on the wings are identifiable and distinct. That's how a lot of today's species can be most easily identified, is by the patterns in the wings. So these are useful, but it means there are a lot of things about the rest of the biology and anatomy that are a bit more mysterious and a bit harder to make clear descriptions and histories of, just because we're lacking a lot of those parts. But there's still plenty for us to discuss. First, let's talk about the origins. The oldest Hemiptera fossils show up in the Carboniferous. So
Makes sense. That's when all the bugs are showing up.
Yep. These are when those true bugs with the sucking mouth parts show up. In the Permian is when we see the group called Cicadomorpha, which includes cicadas, but also a number of other related groups, and almost all of which are extinct groups. Mm-hmm. The cicadas and their close cousins are really the only ones that are the surviving members of this group. The descriptions I found for most of them was already fairly cicada-like. Not major hoppers, at least early on, and probably already feeding off of plant fluids. In the Triassic, we see the oldest members of the surviving lineage of Cicadomorpha, Clypeata, which includes cicadas and their cousins today, and an extinct group related to them. But Cicadomorpha was still mostly extinct lineages that did not make it to today. Some of which we will be discussing, but most of which I didn't see come up because they weren't cicada really specific. Mm-hmm. In the Jurassic, Cicadomorpha does very well. We see the lineages, the ancestors to the lineages of the modern superfamilies.
Okay, so the major subgroups of cicadas start to show up.
Yes, with the cicada group and the frog hoppers and leaf hoppers show up during the Jurassic. And likely that Cicadidae and Pterodarctidae likely split during the Jurassic, though it doesn't seem we have fossils at that time where we suspect the split was.
This is the estimate of when the split would have happened.
But based on fossils in the later Jurassic and definitely in the Cretaceous, seem to suggest that this is likely when our two modern groups of cicadas split. So we probably have recognizable cicadas by at least the late Jurassic.
Yeah, so Stegosaurus and Allosaurus could have seen basically modern-looking cicadas.
Yes. The Cretaceous, there's quite the shift over in Cicadomorpha. Most of the lineages that were numerous and successful in the Jurassic die out by the mid-Cretaceous. As one description put it, by the early Cretaceous, the last non-Clypeata Cicadomorpha had died out. So it was only the lineage that led to the modern groups by the Cretaceous.
So moving into the Cretaceous, it sounds like we see a turnover where the abundant ancient groups disappear and modern lineages become abundant.
Yes.
And for anyone who's paying attention to your geologic timescale, there is another major event happening at that time that would seem like it would line up with a turnover of plant-eating insects.
Yep.
That is episode 57, when flowering plants are becoming worldwide successful.
Absolutely. But the vast majority of cicada fossil record is in the Cenozoic after the Cretaceous, with the bulk of it being in the Miocene. That's what they noted as the height of cicada fossils. The fossil record for the two groups of cicadas, our two modern groups, differs quite a bit. Overall, Cicadoidea, which includes both groups, has around 55 genera of represented fossil groups.
Okay, that's not too bad.
Not too bad. Like I said, mostly wing fragments, some body fossils. Almost all, as they put it, adult fossils from the Mesozoic are Pterodarctidae, the hairy cicadas.
Got it. So this is the group, as a reminder, that has only a handful of species today.
In Australia and New Zealand.
Right. So in the Mesozoic, that seems to be the major representative of the true cicada lineage.
For a while, they were the only cicada fossils in the Mesozoic. Recently, a couple of years ago, we found Cicadidae fossils from the Mesozoic, from the Cretaceous.
Okay,
but
interesting.
They were the cicadas for quite some time, to our knowledge, in the Mesozoic. They are quite successful. There's roughly 38 species described in 28 different genera. That's from the northern hemisphere. They range from the very latest Triassic, it sounds like, to the middle Eocene is most of these, where the bulk of those fossils are found. And all of the ones that aren't wings are compression or in amber.
Yep, that makes sense.
Yep.
That's how you get insects.
The fossil record in the southern hemisphere, much worse.
That also makes sense.
Yep.
That is true for a lot of things.
Yeah. There's just a handful of species known from the southern hemisphere. 3 from Australia and 3 from other areas, Brazil and New Zealand. The Cicadidae fossil record is in a similar situation, much better in the northern hemisphere and even worse in the southern hemisphere. Most of their fossils range from the late Cretaceous to the late Pleistocene. Some of those earlier fossils are a bit more dubious in exactly their identification. So one of the papers I was reading said they need to be handled cautiously.
Right.
And said they're definitely date to the Paleocene, right at 65 to 55 million years ago. That those are definitely Cicadidae, but there are some that have been identified into the Cretaceous.
Right, so maybe the family is extended farther back.
And as said earlier, it's thought they've likely split in the Jurassic, but we don't have fossils going, for Cicadidae at least, all the way back.
Yeah.
The hairy cicadas go throughout that time. In the southern hemisphere, there was 1 specimen known from Brazil, and very recently, 3 found in Australia, identified from Australian fossils that are very good fossils.
Oh, great.
And actually inform a lot about the history of that group, going back to the Miocene, which is the age of those fossils. They also preserved 1 species that had a notably large wingspan, estimated at 165 millimeters.
Half a foot.
Half a foot. It makes it larger than any of the cicadas living in Australia now, and the largest known fossil cicada.
Cool.
So,
mega cicada.
Big ol' cicada, which was named Tythopsaltria titan, fittingly.
Sure. The kaiju cicada. Oh man, kaiju cicada. Just take over a solar system.
Yes! Ugh. Just a very, very loud corner of space. The oldest of the Cicadidae fossils known, which are Cretaceous amber, that preserve body fossils, seem to suggest that they are likely silent like today's hairy cicadas.
Oh, so these potential modern Cicadidae lineage, it seemed maybe hadn't developed that famous sound production that we see in the modern ones.
Which is, from all the things I read, seems to be the general consensus that the hairy cicada form of using vibrations through the substrate they're on, the plant matter or branch they're on, is the ancestral form.
Yeah, that makes sense.
That's how they started.
Because that's what their cousins are doing. It's
exactly
what the hairy cicadas do. So dinosaurs back in the Mesozoic might have seen cicadas and perhaps eaten cicadas, but they might not have heard cicadas.
Precisely. Yeah.
Interesting.
Though from everything else I found, it seems they still had the same kind of mouth parts, so they're probably still plant eaters.
Sure, makes sense.
There are also some well-preserved nymphs from the mid-Cretaceous that already have the digging forearms. So it suggests that they were already doing the burrowing underground lifestyle for their juveniles by the Cretaceous at least. So it seems like they've been doing cicada-style things and behavior and life cycle for quite some time. There are some other fossil groups that are notable for comparison to cicadas, though how close they are to cicadas has shifted. There's the Paleontinidae, which are the giant cicadas. This is a group known from the Jurassic to Cretaceous, and were originally grouped within Cicadoidea, but have now been placed in a different group within Cicadomorpha.
Okay, so not as closely related to true cicadas as researchers originally thought.
Yes, and it sounds like there's even some discussion and debate as to how close they are to Cicadomorpha.
Okay, so they're just going to keep moving out and farther away.
Might not actually be that close, but these will come up when you look up fossil cicadas. They were famous for being large, as the name suggests. The first fossil that was found was a forewing that was big enough that it was identified as butterfly, and was originally regarded as the earliest butterfly. Then they realized, nope, it's actually more cicada-like, and it got put into this group. A number of species have a front wing that's greater than 80 millimeters long. So these have large wingspans. They were described as robust and moth-like, with hairy bodies, similar to the hairy cicadas of today.
Yeah.
They evidently had very long rostrums, the mouth part, some extending beyond the end of the abdomen, which is ridiculously that's like butterfly length when it's uncurled.
Yeah.
So maybe they were doing something.
Feeding on giant plants.
Just piercing all the way through the other side.
They were feeding on the roots without digging, just straight through the soil.
These are also notable for being some of the most abundant and diverse hemiptera during the Mesozoic.
Oh, interesting.
Very successful group during that time. Nearly 100 species known from the fossil record. Once again, only a few from the southern hemisphere.
This is a pretty common trend in a lot of fossil groups, and sometimes it can potentially come down to there not being accessible formations of the right geologic age, and a lot of it comes down to just there hasn't been as much research done in the southern hemisphere.
Yes.
Because paleontology, like many sciences, has historically been a northern hemisphere thing.
Absolutely.
So, which is why it happens relatively frequently that a super cool new discovery comes out of Australia or Africa or South America, and researchers go, whoa, we didn't know these were down here.
Yes.
So yeah, because we haven't looked as much.
Yep. There are a few members that it seemed like could be this group from the Triassic, but they mostly prospered during the Jurassic and then became extinct mid-Cretaceous.
So the Mesozoic was full of hairy cicadas and hairy cicada-like bugs.
Yes, exactly. They're separated into two groups, the early giant cicadas and the late. The early ones, mostly in the Jurassic, had elliptical forewings with large hindwings, and one picture on Wikipedia, their back wings were basically the same size, it seemed, as the front wings, at least in some species. So kind of more butterfly looking than the wings today, where the back wing is half the size.
Yeah.
In modern cicadas. Late cicadas in the Cretaceous had triangular forewings with smaller back wings.
Okay, so in some ways a bit more like modern cicadas.
Yes, and this is seen as potentially a trend in evolution to more efficient and maneuverable flying.
Mm-hmm.
That these are quote-unquote better wings.
Yeah.
And might be coinciding with more insectivorous aerial predators coming in the Cretaceous. And that being a driver for you need to be able to dodge now, because slow, inefficient flying just won't cut it. So that about covers our overview of their fossil record. We have some information on like when their digging started, when it seems like, you know, their mouth parts seem to be consistent.
Yeah, different groups of cicadas or cicada-like things coming and going.
One of the big questions that it is hard to answer, though, with a partial fossil record, but even in the fossil record in general, is when did we start to see periodical behavior in cicadas? Part of the reason this is also a hard thing to study is that it is rare. Most cicadas are not periodical. That is not...
Like you said, there's like 3,000 species of cicadas.
And there's only 9 species known today that synchronize, and most of which don't even go up to the 13 and 17 year lengths. Mm-hmm. So it is a fairly rare behavior among cicadas, fairly rare behavior among most animal life, which always makes a thing more difficult to study when you have fewer examples. And it's something that is hard to identify in the fossil record, as we don't know that just because they look like modern cicadas that they weren't one of the ones that was just showing up every year, and that they were one of the ones that would have been emerging as a group every few or handful of years. So there's been a lot of study onto how it happens and what might be the benefits and the drivers for these behaviors, to try to understand.
How would natural selection produce
yes.
this extreme life cycle?
And what are the different systems that either would be required for it to happen or allow it to happen, and how might those be, affected or selected? There are a few things that, especially for Magicicada, the 13-17 year cycle cicadas, that kind of need to be in place for this to work. One, obviously, is long life. Mm-hmm. That you need to expand your lifespan if you're going to stay underground.
Otherwise, you just never come out.
Yep, you just die before the time's right. Some way to be in synchronicity with the other cicadas. Large population size, because if you just pop out in a few hundred, then you just get gobbled up. Mm-hmm. You need that mass population to be part of the benefit. And then I also saw listed complex courtship being a part that has been linked to this. There are a couple of hypotheses for what might have been the initial drivers for this behavior. One of the most famous ones that you'll see mentioned typically is predator satiation. Mm-hmm. That this is in response to predators. That's very often when we see large group of animals.
Yeah, in swarms,
mm-hmm.
and the sort of mass mating clouds and such.
That one of the big drivers for that is often thought to be, if we have numbers, the safety in numbers rule. If we have numbers, the predators can't get all of us. They can't wipe out our population.
Right. This ensures that a portion of the population will mate and persist.
Yes. If we were in a dozen smaller groups, a number of those could get wiped out potentially. Completely consumed, or consumed to a degree that there's just not enough to reproduce.
And cicadas are not the only insects that we see do stuff like this. Like mayflies, very famously.
That's exactly what I was going to say.
Emerge in big synchronized swarms, mate for a few days or whatever, and then they all die off.
Absolutely. Tons of sea animals do this, where they will group together and use that grouping as a safety blanket and a buffer for the predators that gather. This could also be a driver, though, for the dormancy.
Yeah.
As we mentioned earlier, if you are underground long enough that your predators' lifespans are exhausted or is out of sync with their mating cycles, they may not be able to specialize to feed on cicadas, and the cicadas may be able to avoid peak predator populations.
Yeah.
Because they're not in sync with the predator mating cycle. One paper gave the example that if a predator is on, for instance, a 5-year cycle, it will almost never sync up with the 17-year cycle because they are not, one's a prime number and one is going to be on a different pattern, so you will only get them in sync every 85 years.
Right. This is something that's been pointed out about the 13 and 17.
Exactly.
These are prime numbers, and so much of life activities happen on regular cycles, migrations and mating and all this stuff. A long-term prime number means that you will almost never be in the path of the same cycle twice.
Yes.
You're not going to be in the way of this migration multiple times in a row.
If they were on a 15-year cycle, then there's multiple 3-year cycles and 5-year cycles that could sync up with them. And every time they come out, they're likely going to be falling on one of those patterns. 17 and 13 years means they fall on a different patterned year basically every time.
Yes, not until many, many generations down the line would you potentially encounter that same migration or that same seasonal thing.
Now, one paper I found did point out that there's not really a lot of periodical predators in nature.
Right.
So whether or not this really, is as effective when there's not other predators on other multi-year cycles. They're just living year to year mostly. And that most other periodical insects we see are herbivorous.
Yep.
So this isn't a 100% answer, but it is definitely one that comes up, and it definitely could be a major benefit and selective pressure for having such a weird length of time underground.
I could also see it being a way to avoid other insect emergence and spawning events, or whatever other animals, if you have competitors on a regular cycle. This avoids competing with those.
Now, this is also slightly weakened by the fact that the other periodical cicadas are on even year cycles.
Yep.
So they would be syncing up much more regularly with other cycles. So it only really answers the staying dormant for a while to try to avoid specializing predators and these two examples of prime numbers dormancies. So definitely could be part of the answer, but it doesn't answer everything.
Questions remain.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Another often cited potential cause and even timing of when periodical behavior might have started is during the ice ages. That colder periods and longer lengths of low plant production and harsher winters might have benefited insects that could take longer to develop because the plants aren't producing as much, so you can't develop quickly now, and stay down longer to avoid more harsh years, and then just time everything with a one big bang go of mating and emergence.
Yeah.
Instead of dealing with every single harsh year.
Right. Wait until the right conditions, even if the right conditions takes a decade.
Yes. And that could have been something that pressured them to stay down underground longer.
Interesting.
And longer. And
that they're having these Game of Thrones winters.
Yes.
You have to wait through the whole thing.
And that
the Ice Age was not Game of Thrones.
No.
Just to clarify. There were winters and summers.
Winter was coming, but it was also going.
Winter was every year winter came because it's Earth.
But that over time, as generations synced up, you could get the slow formation of these broods, and that each step had enough of a benefit to lead to the next step, basically, of increasing the extreme length and numbers of the emergences.
Yeah.
I saw one thing describe it as the ratcheting system that we've talked about before, that this may have been a thing as they developed more of these features to be periodical, it was hard to lose those features. So it only really evolves one direction.
Right. That there may have been a time where it was something that just happened every now and then. If it was, maybe it was a brood that could come out this year, but could also wait until next year if the conditions weren't met. Or it was, some of them were on a 12-year cycle and some of them were on a 10-year. There was more variation. But that once they hit that seemingly more ideal sweet spot of 13 and 17, they specialized into that.
Yes.
To the point where now it's, well, you couldn't fluctuate off of that very successfully.
Yes, exactly. And that even the increasing years in time might have been something where it was harder to shorten it. The evolutionary system seemed to go in one direction, that ratcheting system that's come up with penguins. We mentioned this, and it's come up, I feel like another news mentioned this. Another potential explanation for the prime numbers is it might also avoid hybridization.
Oh, you're avoiding each other.
You're avoiding each other. And if hybridization is detrimental to the population, which is often the case considered for most species, that you want to avoid hybridization because it's not the idealized mixture of genetics, then being on prime numbers would also help you not sync up with other groups as easily. As we mentioned with the two broods showing up this year, the last time was over 200 years ago.
Yes. Like we talked about in episode 44, that hybridization in some cases can lead to different or even better success, but in other cases can dilute certain traits that are extremely beneficial, especially in highly specialized groups of organisms. So it could be that for, even if not modern cicadas, at least ancestral cicadas, there was some sort of detriment to hybridizing between the broods.
And today we know that they can hybridize. It's been noted in lab and in wild that they can hybridize and produce viable...
15 years ago.
Yes, yeah.
I made that
difference. So it definitely is a danger if it is maladaptive.
Right.
If it is not good for them genetically, then it can happen. So this could be a good blocking, in addition to having different songs and everything. Another hypothesis proposed that it might be that they're working on a mathematical system that ends up in prime numbers. While the nymphs are growing underground, they go through multiple sheds, typically up to 5 sheds, the 5th instar, and then that's the mature nymph that will come out, molt its skin one last time to become an adult. That first instar typically takes a year, and the rest are on sequences of roughly 4. And they noted that if you break it down, you could find that they might be calculating somehow in units of 4. 13 is 1 plus 4 times 3.
Yep.
And 17 is 1 plus 4 times 4. That once you get past that 1, it's just sequences of 4. This is supported by a few things that can happen. There are cicadas that shift in their cycles. And when they shift, it can happen by 1 or 2 years, and that's typically it. But the other times it shifts, it's typically by 4 years.
Okay, so there is a 4-year chunk of cicada life cycle that can kind of add or subtract.
So you can have a 13-year cicada that comes out 4 years late and comes out at 17, and a 17 that can come out 4 years early. And I believe it can go the other ways as well, but it definitely can be both shortened and elongated by 4-year times.
And it happens that cycle of their development is 4 years.
Yes, so it could be that there's some genetic system that is on a 4-year timer, and that's how things get determined.
Interesting.
This would suggest a couple of things. One, it suggests to most, if this is true, that 13 years was probably the original timing for ancestral cicadas, and that 17 years came with enough individuals delaying by 4 years to then create new broods at 17 years, and that became a new population. These 4-year shifts can become permanent if they sync up and interbreed with a group that came out at the same time. So it's not just a thing that's random and rubber banding back and forth, but that individuals from a 13-year group that delay by 4 years come out with a 17-year group.
And now that lineage is just assimilated into that 17-year cycle.
Exactly. So you can definitely get permanent shifts that way. This could be very helpful for nymphs that are slower developing and aren't ready by the time.
Right. It means that if you do delay that one more cycle, there's a brood that's going to be coming out then.
But you won't be by yourself. You will have a group, so you can delay and still be safe.
Yeah.
This has also come into question as to the way that they might be counting the years. Because that's another big question is, how are they keeping track?
Yeah, how do they know?
How do you know it's been 17 years?
I don't even know it's been 17 years.
No. Like, without a calendar, how are you knowing?
If you tell me a thing that happened 17 years ago, I won't believe you.
Yes, exactly. This is kind of an interesting thing. The timing for their emergences and the counting of the years. We have a fairly decent understanding of how they know when to come out, and it's based on temperatures of the soil on the day.
Right.
That seems to be pretty well known.
That tells you what time of the year they emerge.
And what day for us all to sync up on.
Mm-hmm.
How they count the years is a bit more mysterious. I've seen a couple of answers and one that comes up multiple times, so it seems to be a more agreed upon. But I've seen a number of very recent papers saying we do not have good understanding.
Yeah.
So at least some experts think we do not have a solid answer.
Well, it's hard to study.
Yeah.
Because it only happens every 13 to 17 years.
So there are a number of ideas as to how this system might be being tracked. And some of it links to they may be keeping track of units of 4 years.
Yeah.
And that they're not counting every year. It's every 4 years. And then at the end of the 4-year cycle, at which point they've reached their 5th molt, they determine whether or not to come out.
Yep.
And
if no, then it's not like we'll wait till next year. It's we wait another 4 years.
Exactly.
That's what our inbuilt cycle is on.
And so
there's a next president. We will come out for the next president.
Yes. So there's definitely some pattern to that seems to hold. Whether or not that's the pattern they're using to count is harder to determine. It definitely seems to be a genetic counting mechanism. One suggested something, DNA methylation time counter, which I don't know what that is, but that there could be a physical time counter for the DNA. But it does seem to be something genetically ingrained because even cicadas in similar habitats, but are of 13 and 17 year cycles, maintain their cycles.
Yeah.
So they are determining the years based on their lineage, not just what habitat they're in.
Well, and this isn't, a lot of cycles we think about with animal life or even plant life are a yearly cycle, like tree rings and growth and such. But it's not unheard of for animals to have biological cycles that aren't 1 year.
Yes.
Right. Menstrual cycles are an example where that's not that is a regular, recurring, fairly consistent amount of time that is passing that a biological system could then keep track. When we are at this point in that cycle, certain actions can occur.
Absolutely.
Whether it's a yearly cycle or a monthly cycle or whatever.
And the tree rings is one of the ones pointed to. Plants go through yearly cycles. Tree rings they have growth and lack of growth times of year with winter and summer and wet and dry seasons. And that typically, for at least definitely the deciduous forests that go through a spring and winter, cycle of blooming and lack of growth, the xylem changes. The nutrients and the chemicals in it change as they go through their blooms. One group of researchers called it the spring elixir, that this is a notable difference in the fluids of the trees during that time, and that the nymphs could be tracking that and counting the cycles of their host that they're feeding off of.
Interesting.
And that they could be ticking the clock with every time a spring passes. This was supported when one research team took 15-year-old cicadas from a 17-year cycle group.
Right, so almost ready to emerge.
Yep, 2 years out from time to emerge, and they induced 2 cycles of seasonal cycles in the trees they were feeding on. So they dropped their leaves and bloomed twice in 1 year, and the cicadas emerged.
Oh.
Because they counted 17 cycles, but they came out at year 16.
Oh.
So that seems to be a very solid potential answer for how they're counting and keeping track.
Yeah.
Now, how they're actually keeping track, we still don't actually understand.
Right. What is the actual mechanism
Like,
that you count to 17?
Yeah, are you remembering it? Because that doesn't seem like an insect thing to do.
Is it just like ticking a little counter built into
somewhere
you
in your anatomy?
And when it gets to 17, that is enough. It's
Yes.
full or whatever.
Are you still counting units of 4 cycles? Because that could still be happening with this counting mechanism. But it does seem that the way they are or at least noting the years, is very likely due to the host plant they are feeding off of.
Interesting. Which does suggest that this only works with nymphs burrowed into plant roots and stems.
Yes, exactly.
At least the way they're doing it would only work with that life cycle.
I also found it noted that nymphs that were reared for the last 9 months under different lab conditions still came out at the normal emergence time, which seems to suggest that they have their date set 9 months in advance.
Oh, interesting.
So within that last year, toward the beginning of the year, they've already set.
So they're on course. You can't change their course within that last almost a year.
Even if you mess with the plant they're feeding off of.
Huh.
Yeah. So we don't know how they are timing things.
Yeah.
We have some answers and some patterns that have come out, but the exact answer is still pretty much a mystery because, one, it's hard to study.
Yep.
And it's hard to do comparative studies that are the same across multiple groups because it's...
Yeah, there are only so many of them.
Yeah, it's almost a multi-decade study to do it with one group.
Yes. Well, it's hard for the same scientists to do very many of these.
Yes. So it's difficult to study, and it is also difficult to track them while they're underground. Like getting population estimates is hard.
Well, and the implication of the cicada life cycle that there are billions of cicada nymphs just hanging out underground.
It's like when you learn about fungus hyphae and that the majority of the fungus is just little thread-like filaments under the ground and the mushroom is just the fruiting body, and you are walking upon literal tons of fungal material all over the place.
Just if you're walking through a deciduous forest in the eastern United States, one of the things the ground is made of
is millions
is cicadas.
of cicadas.
A significant portion of the volume of the earth beneath your feet is cicadas.
A slumbering horde. That's utterly harmless and adorable.
A cacophony of cicadas. The silent majority.
So cicadas are quite mysterious. And there is another thing that's somewhat mysterious, or at least odd about them, that I found absolutely delightful, is that they are really bad at avoiding predators. They have basically no predator defenses. There are some that will make an alarm call, that can make another little noise that's an alarm call to like alert others. But they, especially these periodical cicadas here in the US, they are notably slow flying and kind of unresponsive to avoiding.
Like slow reflexes.
Yeah. And it's been called predator foolhardiness is the term used in a lot of the studies, a trait unique to periodical cicadas compared to the ones that come out on a more regular basis, which do hide from predators and avoid them more easily or more regularly. These are not cautious around predators, which is part of the reason they've been so interesting to humans. It's very easy to catch them.
You just go pick it up.
They
just sit there.
They don't have any physical defense. They don't have toxins. They don't have stinky, spines, stinky fluids, bad taste. They evidently taste great, like especially to predators.
Sure. They've been eating that tree juices for 17 years.
And they're not good at avoiding. So that's weird. That's a weird thing for a thing that is a very notable prey animal.
It does kind of go along with that predator satiation idea that if part of the point of having such great numbers is that some of you are going to get eaten, then there isn't as powerful a selective pressure to avoid that getting eaten.
Absolutely. And it might actually be beneficial for their group mating strategy. That if you are more secretive and hiding and quieter, you're not good at being a large, loud group
Yeah.
to attract mates. So to be good at being a large, loud group, you might have needed to lower your cautiousness,
Yeah.
so to speak.
You have to just put yourself out there.
You just have to put yourself out there. They also noted that like the slow flying they do not have particularly strong wing muscles, like massive wing muscles. So there's definitely just anatomically they can't fly particularly fast and agilely, but that being approachable might be directly connected to this mass mating and mass emergence, which the other cicadas don't have.
Yeah.
So it's not as beneficial to them. They can be more secretive because their mates aren't everywhere, and that's not the way they're attracting mates.
Yeah. Well, it once again makes me think of mayflies, which are famous for emerging in a giant swarm, living for a few days, and then dying after mating. And they also do the mass swarming, mass mating thing, but they also have an extreme example of, let's call it selective priorities.
Yes.
Like, you emerge for a day or a few days, and you have one job to do.
Yep.
And that job is mating. And mayflies, at least most of the time, I think, maybe all the time, the adults don't have mouth parts.
Yeah, to my knowledge.
They don't eat. They physically are incapable of eating because
That's not the point.
Their biology has deprioritized it. So that's not why you're here. You are here to mate. In light of something like that, it makes perfect sense that whatever selective benefits this might have, these cicadas have just fully deprioritized self-defense.
Yes.
That's not... You are now so specialized in your emergence strategy, in your life cycle, in your communication, which we mentioned it earlier, they are extremely noisy.
Yes.
Highly specialized noise, but they are an instrument. Their whole body is an instrument. That just so much specialization has gone to that function that there's not energetic or evolutionary space left for you to put any effort towards predator avoidance.
Yeah. On that note, one of the other suggestions that was given for the slowness of their flight is that it makes it easier to find a mate if you're flying slowly.
Yeah.
If you're zooming around, you might miss them.
And that's priority.
Yes.
Find a mate, be in this giant group of swarming insects.
Adult cicadas still have mouth parts to feed, but it was noted multiple times in my readings that that's not what they do much of.
Yeah.
They do it to sustain themselves because they are out for weeks potentially, so longer than mayflies. But that's not what they're not mainly feeding. Most of their time, effort, and energy is just into mating.
Yeah.
So yeah.
What a super cool
Right?
group of bugs.
They're fantastic.
Very, and I eagerly await the discovery of the 1,000-year cicadas.
Right?
That we've just never seen before. It'd be 1,001.
Well, they're like the Eternals from Marvel.
Yes.
It's the core of each planet is 1,000.
It's just a bajillion cicadas.
It's a 5 billion year cicada.
And when they emerge, that's when the kaiju show up to feed on them in their synchronized life cycle.
I had so much fun learning about cicadas for this episode. I hope you all enjoyed. We will wrap up here. There's plenty more neat little tidbits about cicadas, and as you mentioned, there's going to be tons of fun articles.
If this episode got you interested in learning more about cicadas, there in your lifetime probably will never be a better time to be interested in learning about cicadas.
This is the best year for it. So keep your eyes and ears out in the coming months for this emergence here in the U.S.
Yeah.
And if you have any questions or your favorite cicada facts or type
stories.
of cicada, yeah, like if you're an insect collector, tell us your favorite cicada.
I remember an instance of being a young kid at like summer camp during, and I don't know what year or what brood it would have been, but there were cicadas everywhere. This was in New York. And the very specific little memory I have is standing next to some other kids, and one of my friends looked at me with this horrified look on his face and said, "Don't move."
Yes.
And I was like, what's happening? He's like, "There's a cicada on your shoulder."
Yes.
And I didn't see it, but he like went over to like shoo it, and I felt it brush my ear as it flew away, this cumbersome flight away. And I don't remember anything else about that experience, but that one specific moment of being perched upon by a cicada.
I had one camping trip I went on in Boy Scouts, and so happened it was an emergence in our area. Because that's the other thing with the broods is that they're not all over the U.S.
Right.
Only these 3 states might have an emergence this year, so it's localized, and it happened to be in our area. And when they molt, their little exoskeletons stay on the trees.
Yeah.
They cling because they cling on and they molt, and then there's no muscles to let loose or relax, so it's just hollow husk still in the shape of gripping on a tree.
Mm-hmm.
So the trees were just covered in these little xenomorph looking cell larva critters all over the trees, and then we got to see a few cicadas, but I was just collecting all these exoskeletons, and I had a little army of zerglings, and it was delightful.
Yeah. This, incidentally, for anybody who hasn't put it together before, is why the Pokemon Nincada works the way it does.
Yeah!
Nincada is bug and ground type, and it is a cicada nymph, and it evolves into Ninjask, which is a flying cicada. And under the right circumstances, when that evolution happens, you can get a additional Pokemon, Shedinja, which is bug and ghost type, which is the husk of the evolutionary process. Some of my absolute favorite bug Pokemon.
It is
that whole trio. Mm-hmm. Fantastic. Love them.
It is one of the coolest little nods to biology Pokemon's ever done, and it's awesome. Before we wrap up this episode, we have one last section, which is our patron question. At certain levels, our patrons can submit questions that we will answer here on the podcast, and we like to answer one every episode. What's our question today, David?
Today's question comes from somebody who has identified themselves as, I listen to you at the gym, which at first I thought was part of the question, but It's not. At the Gym asks, how would you explain evolution to a very inquisitive 4-year-old?
I like this question because this is something that seems very simple, but is a really important thing to consider when you're trying to teach complex scientific topics.
And it also seems very difficult because evolution is this complex, unifying understanding of life on Earth. And a 4-year-old is a 4-year-old.
Yes, and you don't... some 4-year-olds might have been introduced to some scientific concepts because they are interested, but some might not know what DNA is yet. And might not know what, the deep past is. They might not know what 1,000,000 years means.
Yeah.
So it can be tricky to know what is and isn't common knowledge for this small human. I give this some thought, and I'd love for us to kind of both give our takes on it.
I got some ideas.
I think the way I would explain it is I would start by trying to explain the idea of DNA. That inside every animal, inside you, inside me, there's DNA, which is the instructions or the rules for how an animal grows, for how an organism grows. But animal's easy. How an animal grows. It tells an animal how their body should grow. And that little changes can happen to that DNA. That sometimes it can change just a little bit. And usually it doesn't do anything. But sometimes it can make little changes to the rules. And when that animal has a baby, those rules can be different and it can grow a little bit differently. And if that happens over and 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 over, then you can get a new kind of animal that is very different from the one we started with. And that's one big part of how evolution works and how...
little changes in just how the body is.
And I think emphasizing that it's changes in the rules of the body plan, the DNA, and that typically they're not doing, that it's small changes.
Yeah. I have 2 thoughts that come to mind. One is relating it to family structure.
Yes.
Right? Moms and children and grandchildren and so on. Because a 4-year-old probably understands mom and grandma and so on. There is a book called Grandmother Fish, which is specifically this concept of ancestry over time. And part of the answer might just be go find this book. But it talks about, with adorable little pictures, how our great whatever ancestors changed over time, giving rise to small changes. Another thing that comes to mind is, especially for little kids, hands-on activities and demonstration to get them sort of thinking about it. I would do the M&M game.
Yes.
Or a Skittles game where you get... And there's a lot of different versions of how you could do this. But, for example, you can have a colored mat that's red, and then you pour a bunch of M&Ms or Skittles on it or whatever. You tell them to grab as many as they can, one at a time with chopsticks or something, and then time them, and then each time you record how many of each color are left, and you can see that this color is sticking around more, and that helps you understand how certain features, certain aspects of an animal will help it to survive longer in an environment.
Yes. That gives you the natural selection part of how traits get a shift.
Well, because I think an understanding of evolution comes down to a few core concepts, all of which are pretty easy to understand even for little kids. One is that every individual animal is different.
Yes.
And that's super easy. You go out and catch some fish or catch some bugs or something and point out the differences.
Or even just like their friends and family of like, you don't have the same color eyes of all of your friends. You don't have the same color hair.
Right. Two is relationships, which also you can compare parents to child. You can look at, pets or whatever, how certain things are more closely related. And another is deep time.
Yes.
Over long periods of time, things change. And here's a geologic, here's the history of the Earth. At this time, these animals were around, and at this time, these animals were around, and at this time, these animals were around. And if you can get that variation of traits, heritability of traits, and long time periods, and then survivability with your Skittles game, you're getting that foundation in there of what are the pieces that logically lead to evolutionary change over time.
The version of the skill game I used to use when I was on a tour with young kids and needed to give an idea of this answer really quick was I would point at the slight webbing at the base of fingers and be like, all right, we all have that, right? We can all see that. And then I'd say, well, if I was born with more of that, and then me and a friend were swimming and a shark came by, who do you think's going to outswim the shark? Because it's a silly thing and it gets them to laugh, but it's also very obvious that the person with a little bit more webbing would have an edge on outswimming the person with less webbing. That's a very easy feature. And I go, and if my kids have that webbing, then they will also be better swimmers. And if their kids have a little bit more webbing, they will even be better swimmers. And if that helps us survive, then it might change the way we evolve, and it might lead to webbed-handed people, if that's helpful for them to survive. It's a very simplistic version of it, but it gets the idea of a slight difference could be helpful.
Yep.
And it could help something survive, and that will select for it. That will give that trait advantage.
So I think my two general answers are, one, boil it down to those core concepts, which are really extremely intuitive and easy to understand concepts. Because evolution by natural selection isn't one of those like grand complex discoveries like general relativity or whatever. That it's much more similar to like Steno's laws of stratigraphy, where it's like lower layers form first and then newer layers form on top of them.
Yeah.
It's like, well, yeah, this is common sense, but you have to write it down to then understand what emerges from that. That's what natural selection is. Natural selection is a bunch of common sense things we can observe happening. And two is go find resources by people who have like written books and stuff for kids of that age.
Yes.
There are things that are activities or visuals. Because that's the hardest part about explaining a complex scientific topic to a 4-year-old is the explaining part.
Yes.
Because if most 4-year-olds are probably not interested in a lecture.
Yeah.
And listening to that.
Well, and
if
it's
you have visuals or games, that helps out quite a bit.
And it's very easy to accidentally get stuck on one word or one example or one type of, like, that's something I've run into while trying to explain to something with kids is I'll use a word and they get stuck on that word because to them it has a different meaning than I thought it had in their day-to-day life. And they now have associated it with something else and I don't know how to break that association.
Right. And now we're talking about something else.
And now we're on a different set of train tracks. And so having something that is already specialized to that probably would help.
Yeah. Listeners, if you have preferred methods and suggestions for explaining scientific concepts to very young children, let us know. Leave a comment, get into the Discord or on our Patreon, and share your thoughts.
Well, because as is the case with so many scientific concepts, there's a bunch of awesome ways to explain and demonstrate it, And with little kids, having that variety can be majorly helpful, because if it's something that syncs up with their likes and interests, use that one.
Yes. And we have a lot of listeners who are early education teachers and parents.
Yes.
Who probably have firsthand experience doing this exact thing, even more so than we do.
Yes. Well, and I love trying to find those things. Like, if they like cars, go through the way cars have changed. And, how we've progressed with stuff like that. And that could be an easy tool to teach it with.
Yeah.
Good question. Fun concept to think about.
Thank you. At the gym.
And with that, we can wrap up this episode. Check out the blog post for more links and pictures of cicadas. And as always, let us know if you have questions or
further suggestions for topics.
Absolutely. Remember to keep an eye out for our Silver Screen live stream that's coming out and the next Spotlight episode. That series is still happening. Thank you to everyone who requested this episode and our new patrons. Extra special thanks to our top patrons, Sarah May, Daniel the Bug Lover, and Melissa Barksdale. And that's about it. We will now go dormant.
State, we'll have another Cicadas episode in 17 years.
Yes, absolutely. Well, the next time they sync up is...
the next time so in another 221 years.
Yes, absolutely.
You was it 221? Yeah,
yes,
I think
it was
221 years.
Whoever's manning this for us, this is your note to keep better track of this than we did of the ichthyosaur episode number.
The previous cicada emergence is older than the Marvel Cinematic Universe. Older than The Dark Knight. I think the same year as X-Men 3.
That's true.
2007. Also, probably like real world stuff happened.
Yeah.
I think Obama's first term was 2008. I think that's true. This is going to be really embarrassing. Now I'm doing years off the top of my head.
Yep.
I know all the movies. I don't know when the president was.
No, I mean, you know the important stuff. Our dormancy, luckily for you all, is much shorter because we release episodes every fortnight.
Indeed. Yeah, I checked it. It was 2008. I was pretty sure I know. I'm pretty sure I pay attention to world events kind of a little bit.
I don't. Time...
Technically 2009, because that's when the inauguration
that
happens.
Makes sense.
But the election was 2008. These cicadas have no idea. It's been 3 presidents since then.
As soon as it's tomorrow, the past blurs into one vague collage of events of the past.
Everybody enjoy the cicada emergence this year.
Yeah, I'm very excited.
If you're listening to this episode far in the future, which most people probably are, I hope you enjoyed the cicada emergence. Hope you didn't miss it. And if you're listening to this 17 years from now, oh boy, get ready. It's going to be good.
And 13 years from now.
And 221 years from now.
Yep.
Just you wait. 200. If you're listening to this in the year 2245, that sounds like it's right. If you're listening to this in the year 2245, well, you're in for a treat.
Well, and it's fun because you could, if you want to, you could track in your area whichever of these broods is showing up in your area.
Yeah.
And in 13 or 17 years from now, you'll get to see them again. You'll get to see their kids.
You have to say hello. Yeah. I knew your parents back when they were annoying.
Yeah. Just like you are. You follow in their footsteps. You'd make them proud.
You're so similar and slightly different from your parents.
Goodbye.
Thanks for listening to the Common Descent Podcast. You can follow us on Facebook, Twitter, YouTube, and check our WordPress blog for pictures and links after each episode. Huge thanks to our patrons whose support helps keep this podcast running and who get access to bonus goodies on Patreon. The song you're hearing is called On the Origin of Species by Protodome, which we found at ocremix.org. Thanks again for listening. We hope you'll join us next time.